Okay, let's turn to one of the really canonical foundational models in the study of active matter. This is one of the original models of trying to understand kind of how rich collective behavior can arise in out of equilibrium systems just from kind of simple dynamical rules. Okay, and it was kind of based on a model from the kind of computer graphics community, meant to just efficiently simulate realistic enough looking flocks of birds for cartoons. So what is this model? Actually, there's many different versions of the VCheck model. If you're interested in some of the details, there's references in the lecture notes. And I'm going to take a specific kind of simple version of the VCheck model, sometimes called the Vectorial VCheck model. Okay, so what's the idea here? The idea of this model is that we'll have n interacting units specified by a set of kind of positions. So this is going to be specifying a bunch of positions for degrees of freedom, together with a set of orientations, which maybe I'll denote as what is a director pointing in some direction associated with each thing, right? So as a cartoon, we'll say we have these things flying around. Each one of these points has, of course, a position, and then it also has, a direction that it's pointing in. So these n hats are just unit vectors. Here I'm drawing things in the plane because I can barely draw in 2 dimensions, let alone 3. Okay. Okay. And what are the rules that govern the evolution of this model? Well, first there's an update rule which says, every time we go through the fundamental MD loop, right, we're going to update the position of each of these particles just by translating it along the direction that it's pointing, right? So we'll say that there's a characteristic speed that all of these things are flying around with. In the simple version of the model, there's just a single constant characterizing the self-propulsion velocity of every unit in the system. So everything gets updated according to some particular speed. Maybe you have a time step size modulating that, and then everything just moves in the direction of its own director. Okay. And if we were to stop there, this is just a pretty boring model of, ideal gas-like particles, not interacting with each other and just flying off in some direction. Okay. And then the dynamical rule that's added to make this model just, rich and fascinating and unbelievably interesting, is a tendency of particles to align with each other. So it's an update rule on what direction is everything pointing in, is each particle's direction, right? So the rule here, at least one version of the rule, is that the new direction, so the direction at time equals t plus delta t, is going to be given by first taking the average of the directions of any neighbor of particle I. Okay, so I say, let's say that there are m total neighbors. Let me find the average direction of, the particles that are nearby, and, try to point in that direction. We say this is going to be a noisy process, so we add a little bit of just uncorrelated, Gaussian white noise. So this is Gaussian noise, no memory, just, as simple as possible, together with some parameter governing noise strength. And, these things are supposed to be unit vectors, so let me just define some operator, maybe I'll call it P, doesn't matter, which just, operator that returns a normalized vector. A normalized vector. Okay, so what do we have now? We have a model where at every time step, particles move in their own directions a little bit, and then, they look around and, for all of their neighbors, they try to match the direction that their neighbors on average are moving, but they do so imperfectly, and so there's some noise. How do we expect this model to behave as we kind of vary, for instance, the strength of the noise? Well, for very high noise strength, it won't matter what direction things are pointing nearby, because at every time step you'll just randomize your own orientation anyway. So for high noise, you would expect to find yourself in a disordered phase where, particles change their directions and just fly around at random. At zero noise, you would expect that, particles will fly around until they become neighbors with each other, after which they will, perfectly align and lead to these kind of coherent flocks of particles all moving together, right? So in between, of course, there's a transition. And so what we have here is a simple model of flocking. It's out of equilibrium, there's no conservation of momentum here, and we're constantly saying things are flying precisely at a fixed velocity, even when they're interacting so as to reorient their directions of motion. We have this non-equilibrium system that can exhibit a phase transition between a disordered gas at high noise and an ordered flocking state at low noise, right? What we haven't talked about, though, is, how exactly should we be choosing what we mean by, particle I and particle J are neighbors? How to choose neighbors in this model. Oops. Right. So the original model, which I might call a strictly metric model, said, there's an interaction radius. There's an interaction radius. It's another parameter of the model. We'll call it just like R0. And if particle I and particle J are within R0 of each other, then they count as neighbors, and they'll try to align with each other. If they're not, they won't be. It's a totally natural choice to make. It's one that feels so deeply ingrained from our physics training. But is it actually how birds behave, right? Again, we're trying to model, in this case, a specific physical system. We're trying to understand the flocking behavior of birds. And you might ask, is it the case that birds try to line up with all birds within some specific distance of where they are, and ignore birds that are farther away from that? You might suspect that the answer is no on a bunch of different grounds. Birds have eyes, and they tend to look forward and not behind them, so presumably they interact more with things in front of them than behind them. Birds also have brains that can choose to respond differently depending on, am I part of a very dilute flock where the different members are far away? You can still maintain a cohesive flock even if the birds are, well spaced. Am I part of a dense flock? Well, you can have a flock there too, and the same bird brain can accommodate all of these different scenarios. In fact, there's a beautiful body of literature, and there's some references that I've put in the lecture notes that basically have tried to infer the answer to these kinds of questions. How do we choose neighbors in these kinds of models, and how should we determine our alignment rules given sets of neighbors from the data itself? That is, by watching actual flocks of birds and, tracking their motions, or by watching, shoals of schooling fish, actually try to infer from the data what are the answers to some of these questions. And there's a lot of work that suggests that in this kind of realm of what you might call social forces, effective interactions arising between things that are possessed of complicated, internal states, that this kind of metric rule, just choose an interaction radius, which is a function of distance and then evolve according to it, is probably not a good representation of these states. And, maybe a little, self-introspection of like, how do you move when you're part of a moving crowd, for instance, maybe convinces you that this is really not how you behave either, Are you really like mentally calculating distances and choosing to interact when you're, walking in like a crowd or something, choosing to interact with all of the people within a certain range? Or are you basically just paying attention to, the handful of people that are closest to you? And then, trying to maintain some separation and following behavior of that like more limited set, right? So, in fact, this kind of idea of, choosing neighbors topological choice, is one that I think has a lot of justification, both in literature, by thinking about the data itself, and by thinking about, the underlying mechanisms of a lot of these systems. And as I kind of hinted at in the last section, there's not like a unique way of saying, let me write down a graph that says, this is how I'm going to arrange my sets of neighbors. There's many different choices that I think fall under this rubric of what I would call, a topological neighbor list, right? So a few natural choices that I want to make note of, really two that we'll focus on in this lecture. One is the idea of choosing neighbors from a Voronoi tessellation, or equivalently from a Delaney triangulation. And a second way by saying, let me pick, some set of nearest neighbors, regardless of what their distance is. So let me just kind of give you a schematic version of what these different things mean. K nearest neighbors is really, choose a value for k. Choose a value for k. Maybe you say k is 6, and then you say the set of neighbors, the set of neighbors of particle I, for instance, it's the 6 particles closest to I, regardless of how far away they are, right? I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like. These kind of tessellation-based ways of choosing neighbors, I'll talk about them a fair bit more in the next short video, but let me just give you a flavor. So here I've kind of generated a list of basically random numbers in Mathematica, a scripting language of choice for me. Here's the positions of them, and the Voronoi tessellation of this set of points is a way of partitioning all of the space in the plane into regions, into polygonal regions in this two-dimensional setting. So the region that will be associated with this point that I'm hovering my cursor over will be the set of points in the plane closer to this point than to any other point, right? And this would be the kind of Voronoi diagram that you would get from this particular set of points. So here is a polygonal region defining points in the plane closer to here than to any other point. Here's a region associated with this point, and here with this point, and so on. This kind of structure, provides one natural way of defining sets of neighbors in a way which is indirectly related to relative distances, but which has something of a non-metric character. In this case, you might say, let me call neighbors any 2 points which share an edge in this Voronoi diagram. So for instance, comparing this diagram with this set of points, I might say, the neighbors of this point here are, going to be these points, forming the Voronoi neighbor shell. So these ones and this point here, for instance. Right. And I've written, Voronoi tessellation, Delaney triangulation, because the Delaney triangulation and the Voronoi mesh of a set of points are intimately related concepts. So I've made some illustrations that you can see in the lecture notes, or here I just reproduce them. I've taken the same point set that I showed over here, and here in red you see the Voronoi diagram that I drew. If you take the dual graph of this Voronoi tessellation, so for every face that you see in the Voronoi diagram, you draw a point in the centroid, and you connect those centroids via an edge across lines in the original Voronoi diagram. That would be the dual graph. This is called the Delaney triangulation. It has some very nice mathematical properties that I discuss a little bit in the notes, and which you can read about, and dive into on your own. The point is that from one of these mathematical structures, you can immediately reconstruct the other, and there's some nice kind of algorithmic reasons to prefer one over the other. But both of them basically just give you a way of, defining sets of neighbor relations from one of these graphs, saying the set of neighbors of this point will be this set of, other points. These kind of Voronoi neighbor lists especially are really useful when thinking not about flocks, but about dense cellular systems, as we'll talk about kind of later. Okay. One of the things that I think is quite interesting is that, one, there's actually experimental data that suggests that in flocks of birds, something like k nearest neighbors is actually an interestingly powerful and potentially accurate low-order description of how real flocks of birds organize. That is, the actual sets of interactions between birds within a flock. Right. So on the one hand, there's some interesting data that suggests that choosing some type of topological neighbor list is actually appropriate for studying this particular living matter system. The other really important point is that topological versus metric V-check models. So choosing your set of neighbors in the V-check model to be either given by an interaction radius or one of these topological criteria give different answers. These are different. And this is essentially due to some beautiful work by Chate and Ginelli, a paper of which is referenced in the lecture notes, and I encourage everyone to really both read and think about this, where they showed that, for instance, both topological and metric V-check models exhibit the kind of transition between a non-equilibrium disordered state and a non-equilibrium flocking state that you might think is interesting and relevant to describing flocks of birds. But they also showed that the nature of the phase transition between disordered and flocking is qualitatively different. Just making this different choice of how you choose sets of neighbors, right? So I think it's a combination of experimental data informing details of a theoretical model, which actually have qualitatively different physical behaviors. It's exactly the kind of perspective that I think we need to take as we start thinking about these complex systems. The other thing that I want to make sure that I say, it's clear from the research literature that, choosing metric versus topological is a choice that has real implications for what behaviors you're going to observe and what behaviors you're going to predict. It's also clear that that different topological neighbor choices, different topological neighbor list choices, this is also like an important different choice, are also different from each other. And I apologize for my handwriting. You definitely know by now that it's atrocious, different from each other. So it goes. And let me just kind of point out one really important difference that illustrates this. Okay. In one way of choosing topological neighbor lists, this kind of way of constructing either a Voronoi tessellation or a Delaney triangulation of a point set, and then choosing your neighbor relations based on the edges in, those respective graphs. In this way, if, I is a neighbor of J, then, J is a neighbor of I, right? I use, one of these kind of methods to build up a, list of, here are a bunch of edges in between degrees of freedom. And so, if I and J are connected by an edge, each is a neighbor of the other, right? In contrast, if I think about something like k nearest neighbors, I can be a neighbor of J, can be a neighbor of J with, J not a neighbor of I. Right? So for instance, suppose I have, a bunch of interacting particles, like in this V-check kind of system, but there's like density inhomogeneities in my system. So maybe there's like a dense flock over here, and then like a diffuse set of particles that haven't joined the flock for whatever reason, or maybe there's a phase coexistence, I don't know. For whatever reason, suppose this is the situation I find my simulation in. Well, if I look over here, the handful of closest particles to one of these points might be like, say, something like this, right? Whereas the handful of closest points to this particle might be, how many did I draw here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, well, maybe it's this one, 4, 5, maybe something like this. Right? Because of density inhomogeneities in this particular case, you can see that there's at least the possibility that, this red particle interacts with this blue particle, believes that blue is one of its neighbors, whereas this blue particle does not believe that red is one of its neighbors. Equivalently, you can easily find yourself in a situation where, Newton's third law is not obeyed, right? Fij is not necessarily going to be Fji. Now, for these V-check models, I haven't really written things in terms of forces. I've written just an alignment rule. And so here, the effect of I on aligning J is not the same as the effect of J on aligning I. But you can imagine this generalizing beyond just models of flocking to models where there are forces, but where the sets of neighbors that those forces, are important for, suddenly you have this non-reciprocity relationship. And the idea of non-reciprocal forces is, very strange if you're used to thinking about, forces, forces as being given by, gradients of energies, where those energies are all functions, say, of just relative separations. Energy is a function of sets of relative separations. But in active and living matter systems, you can easily find yourself in cases where non-reciprocity is important. And some of these topological neighbor lists are kind of automatic ways to build non-reciprocity into your simulations, right? It also helps you kind of, just as a comment, interpret some of the flocking literature where, people have compared, as I said here, well, what are the effects of topological and metric interaction rules on flocking behavior? And different researchers have chosen different topological rules for constructing your sets of neighbors, either based on Voronoi or k-nearest neighbors or other similar ideas. And they can easily get, qualitatively different physics because, even just in that distinction, you can see that there's an important physical difference manifest. One of these neighbor lists respects reciprocity and one disrespects reciprocity.